Chemical giant Bayer is on the defensive after a second US court ruled the herbicide glyphosate causes cancer. The owner of Monsanto, which manufactures popular weed killer Roundup, is now facing more than 11,000 lawsuits in the US alone. Legal experts say the US court cases are bellwethers that could lead to tougher regulation or even an eventual ban of the herbicide. About $200 million worth of glyphosate was used in Australia in 2016, a fraction of the $6 billion worth of the chemical used globally. Australian farmers say their livelihoods rely on it, but can they afford to continue to use it? I spoke to Rabobank agricultural analyst Wes Lefroy. Wes Lefroy, thanks for speaking to The Business.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
Wes, glyphosate is the most widely used herbicide in the world, but is that likely to change anytime soon, considering what we've heard out of the US?
Well, there has been a move globally against the use of glyphosate, and we've seen that more and more in the news. But here in Australia, we certainly don't see any change in the regulation. And in particular, we've seen the regulator in Australia, the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Association, or the APVMA, come out in August last year and reiterate their position that they don't see a reason to reevaluate the use of glyphosate in Australia.
Is that position still tenable, though, considering that those court cases did rule that glyphosate was a contributing factor to those two gentlemen getting cancer?
Well, the APVMA have taken the approach and reiterated their approach about scientific-based evidence. And while I can't comment on behalf of the regulator here in Australia, I think more broadly, the industry, is looking for the scientific evidence around impact of glyphosate on health, and we haven't seen anything contrary to that, certainly from the science-based approach. So no, we think that position is still very tenable.
There are some countries, though, that have regulated or, in fact, banned the use of glyphosate. Are there any regulations here in Australia?
So the APVMA regulate the use of glyphosate in Australia. So every glyphosate or every chemical containing glyphosate must be accurately labelled and used in a manner according to those labelled conditions around, rates for different crops, first aid, the types of clothing that each person must wear when handling these chemicals. So the glyphosate is heavily regulated in terms of its use for particular crops and also how it's handled.
What's the benefit for producers who do use it?
Glyphosate is an integral part of the Australian, in particular the Australian cropping system, for two reasons. First, we operate in a system here where soil moisture is king. So glyphosate essentially helps us kill weeds to preserve soil moisture during the summer, but also helps us reduce weeds just prior to sowing. To essentially promote the health of the crops that we're growing, such as wheat and barley, and reduce weed pressure.
Are there alternatives?
If we were to see glyphosate being removed or reduced from the Australian system, we would see a return back to manual tillage, such as ploughing, which would have obvious impacts on things like soil health. We would see increased rates of erosion in particular, but also we'd see farmers using a lot more fuel. A lot of Australian farmers, glyphosate is the #1 tool for killing weeds, and they're heavily reliant on the use of glyphosate. But to preserve its impact, they're naturally trying to reduce their use of glyphosate and using other strategies such as strategic tillage, harvest weed seed control, agronomic methods and strategies such as rotating different crops through, and also the use of alternate chemicals already. So, for the preservation of glyphosate within the system, farmers are already trying to minimise its use and limit the resistance to glyphosate.
How closely do you think producers are watching these two cases in the US?
While we don't see any impacts here in Australia, it's certainly something to watch, and for Australia in particular, being an export-reliant nation, we're heavily dependent on that global market. So, from that aspect, Australian farmers are certainly watching very closely.
Would some farms be uneconomical if they couldn't use glyphosate?
I want to reiterate our position that we don't see the regulation around glyphosate being changed in Australia anytime soon. But if we were to see a reduction in glyphosate use or it being deleted from our system entirely, we would see an extremely large fall in production.
Wes Lefroy, thanks for speaking to the business.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thanks for having me.